Former Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Göran Persson, chaired the Think Forest from its launch in 2012 and retired as president of Think Forest earlier this year. We are very grateful for his contribution and how he managed to develop this forum to what it is today. We have a new president of Think Forest Forum, Janus Potočnik. He's well known to many of you, but let me... I'm not sure what that means. Then it stopped, and it started. Okay. I'll try again. Janus Potočnik is also co-chair of the International Resource Panel hosted by UNEP, chairman of the Forum of the Future of Agriculture, and a member of the European Policy Center Advisory Council. After a career in Slovenia as researcher at the Institute of Economic Research, director of the Institute of Macroeconomic Analysis and Development, he was appointed head of negotiation team for the accession of Slovenia to the EU. And he had a number of other duties in the government. In 2004, he joined the European Commission, first as a shadow commissioner for enlargement, then as commissioner responsible for science and research, and from 2010 to 2014 as commissioner for environment. I was based in Brussels at that time, and I attached the concept of circular economy to Janus Potočnik's name. You became the Mr. Circular Economy to all of us at that time. We are in the best hands. That's my point. And we are very grateful to Janus Potočnik for being president of Think Forest. We look forward to cooperating with you for the coming years, and we look very much forward to today's consideration of the future of plantation forest in Europe. Janus Potočnik, please.
If I would know which one works. Yeah, it's fine. Good morning, everybody. It's still nice to see that the alarm goes on where your name is mentioned in Brussels. So it's a great pleasure to be in this position, and I'm grateful to everybody in particular from European Forest Institute for the trust. But since we have things on which we want to focus today, I would go straight to the point. And first I would try to put some things a bit in the context, and then we will continue with 3 presentations, and finally have a panel debate. And panel debate will be moderated by Bart, and during that time, of course, you will be very much welcomed to contribute to what you think and what are your views about the things which we are presenting. But it will be difficult not to start with some connection with the just released Green Deal. Frankly, you can think whatever you want about the Green Deal, but if I would be in a position 10 years ago to get something like that on the table, that would be a miracle. So we have totally different start than it was the start of some previous commissions. So I don't know if anybody knows, but twice in the college I tried to introduce in the narrative which we have had at that time, which was growth and jobs, to introduce a simple word, sustainable, and it was no-go. Now we are starting with the Green Deal as a kind of departure of our activity. And of course, it will not be an easy ride, and everybody knows that, but I think it's important that we understand that this is introducing a kind of new logic, new approach, new political narrative. It's an important document and important moment for all of us. I cannot resist to start with few basic quotes from there. It is a new growth strategy that aims to transform European Union into a fair, prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050 and where economic growth is decoupled from the resource use. And maybe even more important, it also aims to protect, conserve, and enhance the European Union's natural capital and protect the health and well-being of citizens from environment-related risks and impacts. Most important for today's session are the parts which are related to forests, which are addressed under a chapter titled Preserving and Restoring Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Forest ecosystems are under increasing pressure as a result of climate change. The European Union's forest area needs to improve, both in quality and quantity, for the European Union to reach climate neutrality and a healthy environment. Sustainable reuse and afforestation and the restoration of degraded forests can increase absorption of CO2 while improving the resilience of forests and promoting the circular bioeconomy. Building on the 2030 biodiversity strategy, the Commission will prepare a new European Union forest strategy covering the whole forest cycle and promoting the many services that forests provide. The new EU forest strategy will have as its key objective effective afforestation and forest preservation and restoration in Europe to help to increase the absorption of the CO2, reduce the incidence and extent of forest fires, and promote the bioeconomy in full respect of ecological principles favorable to biodiversity. The national strategic plans under the Common Agricultural Policy should incentivize forest managers to preserve, grow, and manage forests sustainably. Building on the communication on stepping up EU action to protect and restore the world's forest, the Commission will take measures, both regulatory and otherwise, to promote imported products and value chains that do not involve deforestation and forest degradation. Under the funding chapter, it's mentioning European funds, including for rural development, will help rural areas to harness opportunities in the circular and bioeconomy. By the way, all those things will be part of intensive debate. That's what I do assume, because the only thing which you have to do if you are 1 week only in the seat like this Commission was, when basically it released the document, is an enormous need to create ownership for the document, which means that a lot of the things which I've written will be heavily discussed. So I think the best nicely summary which you can find is summarized in the title which the European Policy Center actually provided in their comments, a promising start and a long road ahead. And I think that's exactly what the Green Deal is. And if I try to put it in the context and then bring it closer to the topic which is on our agenda today, you know, I think it is of course important that we understand in which kind of the world we are currently living. And the nicely explained transition from the Club of Rome, it's basically saying that we moved from a so-called empty world, which was dominated by nature, and where the limiting factors of human well-being, economics, were labor and infrastructure, to the so-called full world, which is now dominated by humans, where the limiting factors of our human well-being are basically the environmental things and natural resources. Which means if you talk about future economic development and well-being, it depends on how we will actually treat natural resources and nature. And that's absolutely essential that it's understood. If we look to the Wealth Inclusive Index, which is something which was published by UN last year, it has 3 components. One is production component, which is more or less synonym for GDP, gross domestic product. The second component is labor capital, and the third component is natural capital. And if we look to the figures for the last 22 years, that's basically how much it was captured in the report. We see that the production capital, in brackets, GDP, has increased for almost 100% in that period, that the labor capital per capita increased for about 8% in that period, so it was more or less standstill, and that the natural capital per capita in that period decreased in value for almost 40%. So it's not difficult to conclude that a lot of the recorded growth, which we basically record through GDP, was based on depletion of natural capital, and that we are terribly indebting future generations. So for me, the easiest way to explain that is that the signals which we are sending in our market economies are pretty straightforward. Production capital is overvalued and over-rewarded. Net human capital is undervalued and under-rewarded, while natural capital in many cases is not valued and not rewarded at all. And if you are living in a market economy, like it or not, with all intrinsic value which we want to assign to the nature, and it's rightly so, we will pay a high price if we don't value it. So what I do believe it's really important to be understood, and with that I'm basically more or less ending the introduction. It's important to understand that when we talk about biodiversity loss, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about pollution, we talk about states and impacts. We don't talk about causes and drivers. And if you don't deal with causes and drivers, you don't deal with you can't manage the question at all. Why the science is currently more speaking in one voice that biodiversity loss, that climate change, that pollution are connected? Yeah, of course, because they have the same reasons, and the reasons are in human behavior and in the economies which we have developed. So I have heard as Environment Commissioner many times that I cannot introduce that and that because these are additional costs for economic sector. In essence, that's pretty wrong statement because those costs are existing. They are not additional, only that we don't record them. We try to hide them. We don't record them, and producers and consumers are not paying them. And that's what is, in essence, called externalities. This leads me to the question of the most important thing, which is also in the Green Deal, more or less, part of the story, and which is part of the core story. That's, of course, the fight against the climate change, which is pretty much something on which we have to focus, and I think it's not difficult to have agreement about that, which is also bringing us closer to the role of forests and what could be done there. You know, there are, if you look into the Paris Climate Agreement, it's more or less about the energy management. So it's about supply side of energy side. While I have asked many times already, can somebody imagine that in an economy where we would have abundant energy, cheap energy, and practically all renewable energy, but the same models of consumption and production as we have it today in mobility, in housing, in food production, do we think that we have settled the climate change story? No, we didn't. Of course, you deal with a very important question, which absolutely energy is, but the major opportunity which is not used, and it is entirely not part of the climate agreement, it's of course the decoupling of the use of materials, land, water, from the economic growth. And it's essential not only from the climate point, it's essential also from biodiversity point or pollution or whatever. So there are three types of policies which you have to take into account. One is supply side drivers, supply side policies, energy related. One is demand side, where we come to, of course, all the questions which are related to circular economy, if you wish. And the third one is nature-based solutions, which are again not entirely taken into account, far from that actually. And this is part of the solutions which we will deal today with when we talk about the forests. But when we talk about the forests, we could easily talk about decoupling and demand-side solutions. So the part which is very much not today included into the fight against the climate change. And if we want to win that fight, it will be impossible without using all three policy levers which we have in our hands. With that, I'm coming to the question which we want to address today. That's the plantation forests in Europe, challenges and opportunities, how this fits into the story which I have explained. Is it part of the solution? Where is the part of the problem? And for that, I have three, like always, I have lost again the first page. I have three excellent speakers. The first one is Andrew Doyle, the Minister of State for Food, Forestry and Horticulture from Ireland. And Andrew, I would very much like to welcome your comments, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Yanis, for setting the scene for today's event. And just to thank the European Forest Institute for inviting me actually to be here present to open the Think Forest event. As Minister with responsibility for forestry in Ireland and somebody who has planted forests on my own farm back in 1992 first and then in 2016, I look forward to today's discussions. Ireland has had a long association with the EFI and is very supportive of the significant work it carries out in promoting excellence in forestry and helping to inform and shape forest policy internationally. I had the pleasure of visiting Mark Palahi and his colleagues in the EFI last year in their head office in Finland to see firsthand the professionalism indeed and excellent work of the EFI. Ireland has provided funding to the Institute for a range of initiatives over many years, and I'm pleased that we continue to support the Multi-Donor Trust Fund for the period 2018 to 2020. This is an excellent initiative and it demonstrates the power that many countries coming together collectively to carry out work in specific areas and sharing knowledge. The publication we are launching today, Plantation Forests in Europe, Challenges and Opportunities, is one of a number of publications published under the Multi-Donor Trust Fund. And it is helping to inform foresters and citizens on the importance of forestry and providing knowledge to us to help us manage forests sustainably, to use the word, which is thankfully very common in the language at the moment. I look forward to reading this publication and must compliment all the authors on an excellent piece of work. And I'm also pleased that there is one of the case studies is based on Ireland, but I also look forward to learning from other case studies presented in the publication. Although Ireland's forest area is just 11%, we gain considerable knowledge and access to expertise by our association with the EFI, and indeed in the context of our ambition to grow that footprint to 18% and the challenges we face, the principles as outlined in the the thing here behind me really demonstrate the basis for which we can actually achieve that and deal with some of the challenges we are specifically dealing with in Ireland. I look forward to today's discussion on the future plantations in Europe and the contributions from the many impressive line of speakers who will lead and stimulate the debate on why plantation forests are so important. The world's forests play an important role in maintaining the delicate nature cycles that exist on our planet. Over 30% of the land surface of the Earth is forested, and they sequester over 2 billion tonnes of carbon CO2 per year. Forests' role in climate change mitigation and the important role they play are internationally acknowledged. Forests not only sequester carbon from the atmosphere, they also act as long-term carbon in the soils and the living trees and living trees themselves. In addition, the storing of carbon in wood products is also an important part of the transition to a low-carbon economy and helping to avoid the using non-renewable materials with larger carbon footprints. In Ireland, the majority of our forests are planted. In fact, in 1900, we had only 1% cover, so everything since then has been planted, managed forests. And the work the EFI plantation facility over the past decade recognises the importance of these forests in the range of services they provide. Globally, plantation forests form about 7% of the world forests, and yet they supply over a third of the world's timber, according to the FAO. This is an important point and recognises the multi-benefits provided by lots of different types of forests and the important role they play in the production of timber, as well as providing multiple ecosystem services. Climate change is having impacts across a range of forest landscapes, and these impacts will increase in the years ahead. In Ireland, we recently launched a climate action and adaptation plan, building on previous work where the role of forests features strongly and the importance of protecting forests is recognised. We know that the incidence of some diseases and pests are increasing with increasing temperatures. Populations of some insects are breeding multiple times in the same year as winters become milder. When you combine these events with increased wind damage, the capacity to cause significant loss can increase dramatically. It is important that we recognise the risks as early as possible and use the best available information and tools to support the decisions we make. Forest organisations such as EFI are extremely important in the sharing of knowledge and collectively tackling issues and sharing experiences. I was pleased to welcome the EFI International Summer School to Ireland earlier this year to discuss the topic protecting forests, risk assessment and using management tools. It is important as we acquire and develop expertise that we continually strive to improve decision making in the management of forests. It's also important that we are vigilant to protect our forest resource from the threats of pests and diseases and to avoid losing what we have planted through deforestation. Climate change and increased disturbances can result in population epidemics and disease outbreaks, and forest owners and governments must be vigilant at all times and be prepared for change. It is important that our existing forests and the new forests we plant are managed to ensure we maximise their resilience and adaptation to climate change. Natural plantation forests will continue to play an important role in climate change mitigation. But we know that our climate is changing, and protecting our forest resource from pests and diseases is a significant challenge that we must face together. Next year, the Food and Agriculture Organisation have declared 2020 as the International Year of Plant Health, which will be a worldwide initiative which includes the raising of awareness of the public and political decision makers at global, regional and national levels about plant health. Its objective is to promote and strengthen national, regional and local plant health efforts in light of the increasing trade and new pest risks caused through climate change. And I was very pleased to be in Rome 2 weeks ago, actually at the launch of the next year as being the International Year of Plant Health. It's also important that we continue to create conditions to continue the sharing of knowledge between foresters and researchers. It is essential we continue to connect with the wider public on the important roles that forests contribute to society and the public good they create. Evidence-based research must continue to inform forest policy. Forestry has an important role to play as we transition and decarbonise our economies. Our climate is changing and we need to mobilise all measures to ensure we reduce our emissions, and forestry is part of this transition. Higher ambition and environmental and climate action are part of the new Common Agricultural Policy post-2020, and it is proposed that 40% of the overall CAP budget will contribute to climate action. This will require landowners to achieve a higher level of environmental ambition through both mandatory and incentive-based measures, supporting a just transition to a low-carbon future. And as Yanis has said, the new European Green Deal announced last week resets the Commission's commitment to tackling climate change and sets out a pathway of increasing ambition to create a better future. Forests will continue to be a central part of this journey. But we must ensure that we continue to be vigilant in the light of increasing threats. We must continue to work together to share our knowledge and support forums that encourage debate and challenge the way we think about forests. The EFI is at the forefront in encouraging debate, and your motto, connecting knowledge to action, is clearly evident in the work you do and in the publications you produce. So thank you again for inviting me here. I look forward to the presentations and the discussions afterwards this morning, and again to wish everybody well and hope that you all get something very positive out of today's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like now to invite a representative of European Commission, Michael Dumitru, Deputy Director General from DG Agri, to explain us the connection between the Common Agricultural Policy in particular and the plantation forests in the European Union. Michael, the word is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you, President. Good morning, everybody. First of all, please allow me to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to address this seminar and to present the importance of the forest, especially through the perspective of common agricultural policy. Let me first, starting by, I hope this is working, yes, emphasizing the importance of the forest for sustainability and the EU priorities. President Potocnik already quoted from the communication on the Green Deal. I think in Europe, in European Union, we are very fortunate in terms of forest, because we are very rich in forest. And forest is a precious resource for our society, environment, and economy. It is very well recognized in the Paris Agreement, in the EU 2030 energy and climate targets, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal and the Agenda for Sustainable Development for 2030, the European Union Bioeconomy Strategy, and all this confirm the growing relevance of the forest sector in the EU. So the new Commission has adopted the European Green Deal, and this is a flagship initiative for the mandate of this Commission. The Green Deal reflects also the essential role of the forest for achieving the main EU objectives, and I'm speaking about the climate neutrality, the biodiversity conservation, the zero pollution, and the carbon neutral circular economy. They are also crucial to the Commission priorities of preserving rural areas. Delivering their full potential contribution to all these priorities can only be achieved with a policy framework that encompasses them in a balanced way. In the Green Deal, of course, there are a number of initiatives and instruments, and some of them they are very relevant for us, at least in the DG Agriculture and Rural Development. Of course, we have on the table a new CAP reform, and the main tool for the CAP reform is the national strategic plans, and they are going to be the main, let's say, delivery mechanism where we have to look to the higher ambition for environment and climate. But of course, there are a number of other initiatives, so some of them they already mentioned. So there's an industrial strategy. We're going to work on a farm-to-fork communication to make the whole food chain more sustainable. And we're also looking to a long-term vision for rural area, because forests also they play a very important economic, social, environment, climate role for the rural areas in Europe. And of course, last but not least, we have now a EU forest strategy, and the sustainable forest management, multifunctional role of forest, resource efficiency, and increased global forest responsibility are the key principles guiding this EU strategy. And It is mentioned in the European Green Deal that Europe is going to draft a new strategy, and of course this guiding principle will be considered also for the future. So let me have a short look on the main topic of today, plantation forest, afforestation, and sustainable forest management. So as I already mentioned, so more than 40% of the EU territories is covered by forest, and the forest area and the carbon stock in EU are steadily increasing. The forest area is increasing by plantation, but also by natural generation. And of course, the sustainable forest management is playing a crucial role. The EU harvests about 70% of its annual wood grow in Europe, and with the increase of forest area, this is still giving a possibility to increase the supply of wood without undermining sustainable forest management. But the challenges for the future will demand attention to trade-off on the manifold objective pursuit. Afforestation, forest restoration, and forest management can significantly contribute to our sustainable agenda, helping mitigate climate change, attenuating the impact on climate change, addressing desertification, supporting ecosystem services, provisions such as water regulation and pollution control. Forest and afforested area, sustainably managed, are also important to ensure supply of wood and non-wood products as biomaterials and substitute products, especially for construction and other stable carbon storage options, are among those most promising. I mean, I know that the wood can substitute many things, and there are prospects of being more and more substituting other products like plastic, concrete I mentioned already, even textiles and a lot of other materials. So nearly half of the EU renewable energy comes from biomass, mostly from forestry and planted forest, and can also enhance this contribution respecting the sustainability criteria on forest biomass used for energy recently adopted. So let's look to the role of the CAP in plantation forest and afforestation. The support for afforestation and tree planting is not new for the CAP. The EU support for planting forests started in the late 80s. Already in the first EU forest strategy, which has been adopted in 1998, this support for afforestation funding was foreseen for the rural development policy, for the second pillar of the common agriculture policy. And since then, 2 million hectares of forest have been created with the CAP funds. Now we are in a new cycle of the common agriculture policy that started in 2014 and will last in 2020. And many member states in their rural development programs, and we have counted that 59 out of the 118 rural development programs, they have support for afforestation in the rural development programs, and there is a target foreseen of 240,000 hectares of afforestation. Of course, plantation is not the only story, so we need subsequent management, sustainable management of the forest. Afforestation, reforestation, and forest restoration are only the first step towards mature and functional forest able to deliver an array of environment, social, and economic services. Furthermore, benefit from costly planting effort can be overshadowed if the 40% of the EU land covered by forest is poorly managed, lost, or degraded. So currently in the EU, 4 million hectares of natural and planted forests are severely damaged by pest extreme events, and 500,000 hectares are burned annually by forest fire. Sustainable forest management can be supported through the set of the CAP forest measures, which supplement the support for establishing a forest and plantation to improve their economic, social, and ecological value and boost their resilience, preventing damages and impact on climate change. The CAP stands as a key funding source for the EU forest, providing a wide range of opportunities for afforestation to prevention, restoration, improving resilience, conservation within and outside the Natura 2000 sites, genetic conservation, and productive investment and processing of forest products. According to the latest figures available in the Rural Development Programme, the total public expenditure plan for all forest measures, specific measures, is 7.4 billion euro in the rural development second pillar. This is a public expenditure including the EU budget and the national contribution. All full implementation of this plan measure will mean 330,000 hectares of new forest and agroforestry area, forest management of 400,000 hectares in the Natura 2000 sites, and 1 million hectares of other forests under voluntary forest environment payments. As you can see, the CAP remained the main financial support for addressing forest measures in rural development policy. Coming now to the future, and looking to environment requirements, the recent EPBS report recognized the importance of promoting the multifunctional forest and sustainable forest management, and also the intensive production in well-managed forests to reduce pressure elsewhere to achieve transformative changes. Afforestation support by CAP is currently subject to minimum environmental requirement, and this is to avoid inappropriate afforestation in different areas or using species which are not appropriate for the ecosystems. For the future, as I mentioned, we have on the table a new CAP proposal, which is still with the co-legislators. We hope that this will be adopted soon, at least next year, so that the member states they can proceed with their CAP strategic plans. The CAP strategic plans, the novelty in this period we propose is that we have a different partnership between the EU level, the Brussels level, and the member states, because we want to give much more flexibility and possibility to the member states to adjust the intervention in strategic plan to a way that fits the local, national, regional, local context. So therefore, it will be very, very important that the member states they start working on the CAP plan. We keep all the toolbox for forestry, but we, of course, with this additional flexibility. So the new proposal envisage more focus on performance. So we want to measure the performance of the CAP against pre-established targets. We are going to look less to the legality and regularity of spending money, but we are going to look much more on what we achieve with this money. So we will continue our policy that investment in afforestation should stay in line with the sustainable forest management principle. And we will maintain the requirements, for instance, the obligation above a certain threshold of a certain area that there will be a management plan. This will be an eligibility condition. Of course, we have to be more ambitious, and the CAP strategic plan, it is considered to be the main delivery mechanism for higher ambition in environment and climate for agriculture and the rural area. But for this ambition, we need two sides. We need the Commission, which is demanding, and we need the Member States, which is going to propose this and aim for it in the planning first and then in the implementation. Of course, we have a number of instruments targeting this higher ambition, which goes from ring fencing of money to the type of interventions. But we can continue, and we consider the CAP will remain the most important source of financing for forest, for afforestation, for plantation forest, and for the multifunctional role of the forest. Then we are going to elaborate this new forest strategy, and in this forest strategy, the good news is that this is a standalone strategy, and it's going to have a holistic approach to cover all the aspects, economic, environment, climate, and social. Of course, we are going to link in close cooperation with many other initiatives, including the biodiversity strategy. And we have to ensure that there is a strong coherence with all the other initiatives. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a very successful seminar, and I will stay here with you. If you have any comments or any question, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. I think it was a good overview, and in particular, it's appreciated that you stay for any kind of debate and questions later on. Now, before we go to the panel discussion, we have the last presentation, which will be done by Professor Peter Freer-Smith, University of California, Davis, United States of America, about the plantation forests, potential and impacts in Europe. Please, Peter.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today. I've always wanted to speak to a Think Forest forum. Maybe the secret is to move to America. Okay. So the background, or you could say the challenges, actually. We know that globally forest area is decreasing, but actually plantation forest is increasing, including in Europe, as we've already heard. We should be open about the challenges. Plantation forestry has not always been popular with local communities. There have been problems, and we should acknowledge those. We know something about them now. That's been a challenge. And also, the policy context is changing. We know about the need for climate mitigation, and we've already heard about the circular bioeconomy. So things are changing. There is a real challenge. This is the report I want to describe to you today. I must pause and acknowledge my other authors. 4 of these authors are in the room today. I think maybe 5, actually, 4. A really good group of scientists from 9 European countries. I think, for me, a model of how this sort of science should be done. I'd also like to thank EFI and the Multi-Donor Trust Fund for the funding to do this sort of work. We really think this has been important. So I've given the question again here. How is it that plantation forestry should best, how can we optimize going forward its contribution to our socioeconomic demands and our landscape demands, our biodiversity demands in Europe? I'm tempted, we could rephrase it actually, how can plantation forests contribute best to the Green Deal going forward? It's a similar challenge. The good news, as I say at the bottom here, is that the science is strong. Our report, I can highly recommend the report to you. I've got a short time only to say a few words about it today. I hope that those of you who have already looked at it, and as you look at it in future, you will see the rich data sources in that report that have allowed me to draw the conclusions I'm going to draw today. Some really sound evidence and well-cited literature. And we based that on studies in 4 European countries. I've circled them here. In each country, we talked about the general, that's the governance and the institutional arrangements. We looked at the detail of what forestry had achieved, and we looked at one particular silvicultural system in each country. We had a great group of reviewers, one of them sitting in the room here, and they said we hadn't sufficiently considered Central Europe. So we did add a site study, Zernenwood, southwest of here, about 100 kilometers maybe, to get one more Central European silvicultural system into the analysis. We looked at sustainability, we looked at risk, we looked at ecosystem services, we looked at governance and institutional arrangements, and we looked at future predictions. So a very comprehensive piece of work. I can't resist showing you some of the forests. This is what it's all about. So our 4 country studies, first of all, Italy, and we looked, the silvicultural system was poplar. That is the most intensive of the systems we looked at. Underneath that, in the Republic of Ireland, some Sitka spruce, very beautiful forests, as indeed all these forests are. Going down in the order of intensive management, Norway spruce, we looked at in southern Sweden, and Scots pine all the way down to the south east of Europe in Georgia. And what do we conclude from this analysis? So there is a broad range of silvicultural options available to us. We looked at the land use impacts. That's the impacts on vegetation, biodiversity, water, and soils of each of those systems. A methodology developed by one of the cost actions, I give the reference here. No, I don't actually, but the reference is in the report. Very interesting. All 5 of our systems showed land use impacts that were substantially less than that for agricultural grain production areas. Substantially less land use impacts. On an initial analysis, when you look at the land use, the more intensive systems have a larger land use impact. But if you look at land use impact per production unit, that's per the land you use, the time you use it for, to produce 1 cubic meter of timber, the situation is reversed. The more intensive systems have a smaller land use impact per production unit. That's a really important conclusion. It means that these 2 options for land use that we show in the second bullet here, that is land sharing, multifunctionality, and land sparing, protecting other areas, both those approaches are valuable in a landscape scale mosaic approach. So that's a really important conclusion for us. The third chapter of our report, we look at the risks, pests, pathogens, fire, wind throw. That's a very detailed and tightly referenced chapter. And conclusions there are that by species choice, management, and using mixtures, diversity, we can substantially address the risks in forests. We looked in detail at ecosystem services and how you can achieve trade-offs through your design and management decisions. So productive forests, provided you use the right management systems, can contribute across the range of ecosystem services, biodiversity protection, recreational use, and particularly climate mitigation. Stakeholder engagement. I mentioned there have been some problems at the beginning. The good news here is that we now know how to understand stakeholder views, how to take them into account in our design and management. And that, of course, is a really important thing to do. Ecological integrity and using forestry to reclaim degraded land is something we've already had mentioned, actually, so thank you for that. I can move on quite quickly on it. Supplying goods and services going forward. So this is the forward look. The interesting thing is that although you would expect, and there is good evidence that globally demand for timber is increasing globally, actually we know that the situation is more complicated than that. The industry has undergone striking changes in the demand side with increasing diversity. So it's not quite as simple, the future demand, and we do need to factor that into our models. Genetic diversity is important. This is the bottom bullet here. So the real advantage of plantations, that you can choose your species, you can choose your genetic material to get adaptability to future issues, future climate, future environmental problems, and you can think about land use, wood use, production use going forward. So the full chain from beginning to end, the full value chain. So, policy recommendations. We know already that plantation forests are contributing substantially to policy requirements in Europe. The evidence we present in this report suggests from a diversity of European case studies that in order to achieve these sorts of benefits, you do need the right institutional arrangements, governance arrangements, programs and research. So there's a need for all those things going forward. I've talked quite a lot about risks, so I'll be very, very quick on this second bullet here. Just perhaps emphasize again that it's about species choice management and genetic conservation. I think my last slide. Sometimes you think you've got the right words, but you may not have them in the right order. And that's what I think about this last slide that I'm going to show you. What I really want to emphasize on this slide is the new equilibrium. So that's an interesting one. Why did we come up with this view that a new equilibrium was needed? So I'll try and explain that. It's partly that the policy requirements are changing going forward. It's partly that we know future demand is complicated, that the demand side has undergone changes, it's diversifying, it needs to contribute to the circular bioeconomy. But the evidence is that we can have healthy and productive forests which also meet biodiversity, recreational and ecological integrity needs. We can have that, but to achieve it, we do need to think about the environmental impacts, the balance of ecosystem services, and the stakeholder views. So that's really what we meant about, well, there's one other thing. That's partly what we meant about a new equilibrium, but it's this point here on the third bullet that, the second bullet, you need to take into account in designing those balancing those issues, the full value chain from planting through to utilization. And lastly, just to reiterate, it really came across clearly from our report that there is no one-size-fits-all. Institutional arrangements, indeed progress on using plantation forests effectively is very varied across Europe. So we need to take that into account as we try to reach this new equilibrium. Thank you very much, Chair.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this presentation. And we are actually 5 minutes ahead of time, which is miracle. Now we will switch to the panel discussion, where I would very much also welcome your contributions. As I already mentioned before, moderator of the discussion will be Bart Muis, professor from Leuven University. And I would also like to invite on the stage Pedro Albizu, director, Smurfit Kappa Paper from Spain, Joe O'Hara, CEO, Scottish Forestry, Luis Neves Silva, lead New Generation Plantation, WWF, and Margarita Tomé, professor, Instituto Superior de Agronomía, University of Lisbon. If that was correct, I don't know, but you are all welcomed to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for introducing us. So I don't have to do that. Nevertheless, I would like to hear a bit more from our panelists how they and their career is linked to the future of plantation forests. So I would first like to ask to Pedro Albizu, what is your linkage to the future of plantation forests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, my background is I'm a forest engineer. I started to work 37 years ago in a forest association for 7 years, and from 1990, so the last 30 years, I have been in charge of supply of wood and biomass to paper mills and various sawmills in the north of Spain. I have knowledge on this area and plantations mainly, and I have had different situations. I have been in situations where forest fires affected 30 years ago the plantations, and the plantations were cut and were replanted, and there was again interest to continue in this job. So I know practically everything from the planting to the extracting and the managing and thinning and all the things that badly affected the forest activity, like pests and diseases recently, and yeah, I have different views on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Joe O'Hara, CEO at Scottish Forestry, what is your linkage to the future of plantation forests?
Hello, thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. So my link to the future and to the past is I'm a professional forester, have been for 30 years, and I've done a journey from the forest floor to the floor of the Parliament. So I've done everything from redesigning one of the largest plantation forests in Europe at Kielder Forest on the border between Scotland and England, led IT systems designed to help us redesign forests and integrate them better. And currently, I'm the Scottish Government's lead official for forestry policy. And in the last year, we have written new legislation, set up new bodies in government for delivering forestry, and introduced a new forestry strategy that received unanimous support in the Parliament. So all of that really has been a very strong connection with deep roots in the technical side of forestry, right the way through to how we can use it in terms of driving our response to the global climate emergency.
Thank you very much. Mr. Luis Neves Silva, head of the New Generation Plantations platform of WWF. What is your linkage to the future of plantation forests?
Well, I'm a forest engineer from the Lisbon University, and the truth is here Margarita, she has a very strong responsibility on my relation with plantations because she has been my professor And at the time I was a young student and thinking that to become a forester was all about beautiful natural forests. That was my big task. She started to tell me the importance of working with forest plantations. And since then, I've had 15 years of experience working in Portugal with small landowners associations, given that's very important where I come from. We have the regime of land in Portugal. It's very, very small scale producers. And then I came across also a few years within the private sector before joining WWF, which has been crucial because when I joined this very large conservation organization working globally, my experience with the private sector allowed me to bring that angle into the work on conservation, and I have had the privilege to start coordinating a project 12 years ago, which is called the New Generation Plantations. And today it is a platform with about 12 of the largest and more leading in terms of thinking and practices plantation companies and government departments around the world, where basically we act as a think tank, but dedicated to plantations management and trying to understand from the different stakeholders, from civil society, local communities, private sector, and public sector, how can we build models which they basically reflect at the landscape level the holistic approach that we have heard here that we need to bring into the sector. So basically that's my link with the theme. During these 12 years I've been leading this platform.
Well, thank you very much. And last but not least, Professor Margarida Tomé from the University of Lisboa. What is your linkage to the plantation forest?
Okay, my connection with plantation started a long time ago in '76, when the first demonstrations in Portugal against eucalypt plantations started. And then at that time I was still a student, but almost turning into a professor. And we, in order to create a scientific basis to support or not the demonstrations against eucalypts, we founded a forest research center that had as unique objective to study the ecosystem of eucalypts. And we studied all the issues related to eucalypts, water use, etc., during several years. And I think that after some years, we have some knowledge, not all the knowledge that is needed. It's never ending. But that was my first connection with plantations. And then later on, in '98, I was one of the co-founders of the Institut Européen de la Forêt Cultivée, that in English is European Institute of Cultivated Forests, that was funded with the support of the Forest Owners Association, the European Forest Owners Association. And I've been working very much with this institute for many years. I was president for 2 terms or so, I don't remember. And this institute hosted later on one of the EFI project centers, FE Atlantic, then was transformed in FE Plant. So I've been working most of my life with plantations, and very recently I'm also a forest owner. I have some planted forest, small one, of cork oak. So it's a very nice planted forest.
Thank you very much. As you could hear, ladies and gentlemen, we really have an excellent panel which is able to tackle the challenges of plantation forests from different angles, from the angle of the industry, the government, the NGOs, and the science. Really great. Just a few words about myself. So I'm a professor of forest ecology and management at the University of Leuven, just 25 kilometers away from here. After my PhD in forest ecology, I left science for a few years, working in environmental policy, looking at life cycle assessments, sustainability issues, forest certification, and then came back into research. And so my research team worked a lot on sustainability issues, measuring, using criteria, indicators for sustainable forest management, doing LCAs on plantations, bioenergy systems, and so on. And I'm very honored and pleased to have collaborated to some of these high-level policy documents of EFI, focusing the circular bioeconomy, wood for bioenergy, and so also this new document on plantation forests. Okay, I explain you a bit how we will work with this panel discussion. I invited the panelists to formulate a statement, a bit like a tweet, and we will project them one by one. I will ask the other panelists to react on those statements. And like that, we will get some interesting information, I think, about the future of plantation forests. And then in a later stage, I will turn to you, so you can think already about your hot questions, and we will involve you in the debate. Okay, so could I ask for the first slide, first statement? And we work a bit in a different order, which is a more logical order. We go from the plantation to the products. And the first statement is from Professor Tomé. And she stated, a bio-based society implies an increase in the use of wood, which requires an increase in the area of highly productive plantations. But those are usually not loved by society, and conflicts must be solved through science, through stakeholder information and involvement, and through good management. So what she's saying is that to create a circular bioeconomy of the future without petrol and other fossils, we will need more plantations, but plantations have an image problem among the general public. And she says we can solve that with more and better science, with more and better stakeholder information, and with good management. So I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think about it. Ms. O'Hara, please.
Okay, well, there's very little to... I suspect there's probably going to be quite a lot of agreement when we talk about this today. So I'm interested in this. In our country, well, in Scotland and in the UK as a whole, over 90% of our forest resource is of a planted origin. Similar to the comment from the Minister of Ireland. So we only had 5% forest cover 100 years ago. Scotland now has 19% forest cover, most of it plantation, and we have been on this painful journey, similar to you with the eucalypts, and we had Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine. My experience of this, as we get into, probably we're getting into now the third rotation of these plantations, and they started as unpopular, unloved plantations, and they are increasingly becoming more loved forests. Because plantation...
Because they are changing?
They are
the
changing,
people are changing?
and the people are changing.
Okay.
So you're getting the forests are doing their thing by not behaving as the foresters would like them to behave. So getting natural regeneration where you don't want it and where you do want it. You're getting trees dying, pests coming in. So they are evolving over large areas. And the people side of it, absolutely. I think it's more than stakeholders. That you have to get the emotion in people here. I suppose that some of the language in here feels a bit dry to me. Forests are incredibly emotive wherever you look across the world. You need to be able to engage people's emotions in it all, not just the science. There's a lot of deep positive passion for trees, and there is also some strong anti-emotion, negative emotion around plantations, and we need to find that middle ground to tackle both of those and connect emotionally as well as scientifically. So I think that is one of the things that's missing off here. And one of the best ways to do that I found is through art and the use of art, be it language, poetry, or visual. And I think these things come together in design. And so good design, as any engineer will say, whether you're designing a building, a forest, a landscape, really good design brings together the art and the science and the people. And I think that is just the one thing that I would add to your statement.
Okay, that sounds great. And apparently in Scotland, maybe Ireland, people are already at that level that they understand what plantations are about, that they can appreciate them. But maybe in other countries of Europe, we still have more education to do, more perception to do.
We're not there by any means yet,
okay.
but we're on the journey.
Yeah. So I wonder, for example, in Spain, what is the public perception on plantation forest, and can you make some progress there in explaining why you do it and how you do it?
Well, it's true that there is not a unique view on that, and to complement the statement, I think that it's important to mention that sustainability today is a must. So we need to guarantee, if we want to increase the surface dedicated to plantations, I think that one first step is to guarantee that the sustainability will be respected. That is something that is for sure needed. And I think as well that the explanation of why we are going that way is very important, because if we explain that the idea is to combat climate change or to increase the substitution of products coming from non-renewable sources, probably that is better accepted and understood, and probably these effects on more land used for plantations will be better accepted if that is if the awareness of that is increased and the communication works. Inform people probably is ready to accept this kind of that kind of investments. I think that is something that they need to be deal more in that way. It's true that in Spain there is part of a population that doesn't understand why there is more and more plantations of eucalyptus and don't accept that. But the reasons are more in terms of landscape view, more than in reality that is damaging the environment or is harming the water and so on. There is not scientific basis against that. You know? And I think that we need to work more on that, more on information, more in guaranteeing the sustainability, and more in telling why we are taking the decisions. I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So we remind already that we have to communicate with people more to art. We also heard that showing the good example by good management is, of course, the first thing before you can convince people. So, Luis, what is your perception? You work not only in Europe but also outside Europe. Do we also have an image problem in other continents, in other countries? And what do you about it with your WWF initiative? Do you mainly work on improving the management, or is there also something wrong with the perception and with the communication? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think in the Southern Hemisphere, people are more open to other types of systems and more intensive systems. I think here in Europe we are much more sensitive and much more aware, and we have more. I feel that it's more difficult to communicate with society the need for plantations, as compared with if I work in South America, Brazil, Chile, or South Africa. I have this perception that there. Although there are conflicts related with land, they are less specific on relating the conflicts with the plantations itself. Normally, the conflicts are around land, in general, and in different countries in South America. Even society is more open also for new technologies, including the genetic engineering, that here we tend to be more conservative and cautious on all these new approaches. So I think there is a significant difference between Europe and many of the southern countries, but the generalization, it's always a little bit risky, so I'm just talking about the countries where I have more experience. But in general, and in terms of what has been here said, I tend to agree that this is two sides of the same coin. From one side, I tend to think that the forestry sector needs to do the homework and continue its learning curve, acknowledging that in the past, 40 years ago, many of the plantations have been established according to the standards at that time, and today we have a different understanding, and we have learned a lot from what worked and what didn't work, and so it's important to introduce the changes in the landscape and to show the evidence of that change to policymakers and society in general. On the other side of the coin, it's communication to society. Our sector, probably it's not the best one communicating to the different audiences we need to reach. And communication, it's changing very fast, and we need to learn and to keep the pace how to get to citizens of our society. But on that communication, I think, and talking here directly to the quote and to the bio-based concept, I think we have a complex message, and we need to continue working on our message to explain that how the forestry sector can be at the heart of this transition to the bioeconomy, and how we can have better forests and more nature, but at the same time managing, and that harvesting a tree, it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. So it's easy to say here in this room, but it's extremely difficult to communicate to a wide range of audiences. So I think that's the other side of the coin.
Okay, thank you very much. So apparently quite some alleys to find ways to better communicate, also to better explain what we are doing, and also doing the things better. I would like to come back to Margarita, which put the statement. We haven't talked much about the science. What are really the science gaps that can contribute to this better understanding on plantation forests?
There will always be science gaps because forest ecosystems are very complex and there's a lot of variability among sites. So there's a big need for intensive monitoring of sites. Our research is funded by 3-year projects, and sometimes we miss the long-term monitoring, and in order to we need to involve stakeholders, but to involve them, we have to inform them. Their decisions should be based on real science. So I think we cannot forget science. And this is a message for the Commission. I think that in the late calls, you have many calls about dissemination that calls about real science. And this has been a big problem, in my opinion. We came from just calls on science, and now we have a surplus of calls on dissemination and forgetting the calls on science or the projects on science. And I think that we should not forget about that. And also just a word about good management, because Bart did allow me just for 280 words, so it was very difficult, so I had to cut. So good management has to be good management at stand level and at landscape level. At stand level, I think that our knowledge is higher than at landscape level, and at stand level, in the stands that are dedicated to highly productive plantations, we want to optimize productivity, and that's fine. But at landscape level, we should optimize the ecosystem services, and this is much more difficult, but it's where we should go. There's a lot of things going on in many countries. I suppose in Portugal, as I've been around a long time, things are very, very different from what they were several years ago. I still remember then, a long time ago, I organized a scientific meeting in Portugal, and I had a field visit to a big eucalyptus plantation where I had my spacing trials that I thought was perfect. And then no one cared about my trial. They were worried about the 300 hectares of clear cut that had been done in that place, and all were taking pictures about this. And my child lost all the interest. And nowadays, this would be impossible to see in Portugal. So management at landscape level is done in a very different way. Even the big pulp companies, they are managing the eucalypts and all the other ecosystems that are included in the management. So we need to do more at landscape level, but there's a lot of good things going on.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very interesting statement, something to remind that even if the intensity of the plantation at stand level is very high, that at landscape level, a lot of things can be done to make the system more stable, more mixed, more biodiversity conservation and so on. Probably we'll come back on that, on this question on should we go more to land sharing or to land sparing, like Peter Freer explained us. Okay, I think we can go to the second statement. Thank you. So the second statement is by Luis Neves Silva, and he stated, new generation plantations have demonstrated that it is possible to produce timber efficiently and profitably while maintaining ecosystems and contributing to socio-economic development, and that doing so, you can create shared value for communities, restore degraded and deforested land, and contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. Sounds like heaven on earth. So I wonder if the other panelists agree that this is all possible, or maybe a too bright reflection on plantation forests. Yeah, probably we can go in the same order. Please, Joe.
Okay, so we are a enthusiastic and very engaged supporter of NGP in Scotland. I think we've been with you right from the start, Luis, and I think it's an incredible thing. And getting that comparison between the Southern Hemisphere and the North, but those concepts being shared and the people issues being similar, actually, when it comes down to it, in the different areas. There's been much shared learning, I think, in both directions. So I think it's a really important platform, and I hope its moment has now come because of the climate emergency. We're all seeing the need for forests to sequester, to store, and to substitute in order to tackle the climate challenge. And you really show the way with NGP. So I'm sorry if I'm agreeing too much with this, but I do agree with that. I think the key point, though, is it is possible. It doesn't always happen. So there are demonstrations of what is possible, but there are also horrific examples across the globe of how it can go so badly wrong. And because of the length of time of people's memories and the length of time that forests exist for, those mistakes can endure for a terribly long time as well. And I think we do ignore them at our peril. We do need to face up to them, recognise them, and demonstrate that we have learnt from them, from the mistakes of the past, and what we're doing differently.
So yeah, you say the good examples exist and the very bad ones as well.
Yeah.
But what's the share of both? Is it 59% bad examples and 5% good examples, or how is that?
I don't know. I'm hoping that as we redesign, so I can just talk from experience at home in Scotland. So as we redesign the forests, when they get to rotation length of about 40 years, we're hopefully making them better. But it takes 20 years for them to look like a forest again. We have these big square blocks of Sitka spruce on a hillside like this, which look awful. They still appear in photographs, but they were planted to the standards of 40 years ago. But the biggest threat to our industry and to our sector and to the public support for future planting is the photographs of those square blocks damaging the environment that local people cherish. So I don't know what the proportion is, and I don't know what it is globally, but I think we have to be very honest about the mistakes that we've made in the past, and it still takes a lot of effort to stop them from recurring.
Okay, thank you. Pedro, how do you see the situation and the future? Are we exactly moving to this nice examples of integrated management, which is contributing to climate change mitigation, restoring degraded land, or is there still a long path to go? What is your opinion?
No, my opinion is very positive. I'm grateful to Luis to share this idea of new generation plantations from ENGO that is well received from the industry, that we want to be part of the solution, and I think that is a great idea. I was wondering if there is any room for transforming these bad examples of those bad plantations into this new generation idea. And I think that is something that we need to work on that, and to be more inclusive, and to take into account more topics that were not taken into account when decisions were taken 20 or 30 years ago. And I think that is a good way. I think that is very positive, and I hope that it will be successful for the good of all the society. That is, having with us the NGOs is great news.
Okay, thank you. Margarita, you mentioned already that the surface area of clear cuts has tremendously decreased over the years. What, according to you, would be priority actions that we should take for going as quickly as possible to really sustainable plantations in the future?
You know, we have some sustainable plantations, even if you can talk about bad examples. When I was a student, I was taught that forests were producing and had a lot of bens e serviços, shall we call it in Portugal, that are presently ecosystem services. So foresters have always aimed at doing a good management, but it has been a long-term learning process. And I think that nowadays, with the involvement of stakeholders, and with stakeholders claiming that we are not doing a good job, we are even trying to do better than we did in the past. But I think that when we talk about plantations here, Luis talked about some very important thing, is that the plantations are the way to restore degraded and deforested land. That's true. We, men, destroyed in Europe most of our forests, and now we have to make them again. And making forests is planting them. And we can do it in better ways or in less better ways, but it's our duty to try to solve the problem that our ancestors created, and that's what we are doing. In the beginning, we were planting big areas, continuous of monospecific. That's what we thought was good. Then we found out it's not the best thing, but best way to go. So we have been adapting over time, and there's some bad examples, there's some good examples, but I think the new generation plantations bringing a lot of people's stakeholders of different sources to some case studies, visiting these plantations in the field, and I've participated in some of their meetings, and then going to office and having big discussions. I think it's a way to help foresters to improve the way the plantations are managed. Because at the end, plantations are forests, just they have more input from man than the previous plantations.
Yeah, I agree that after the Second World War, European forests had to be built up, so the skills of a forest engineer were to successfully plant, re-establish forests, to start managing them for provision of resources. But of course, requirements change. So the forest engineer of the future, what kind of skills should they have differently than the ones of the past? I think, for example, about understanding effects on other ecosystem services, a basic knowledge of biodiversity. Is that sufficiently present in the current curriculum, or do we work sufficiently on that?
I hope so. Mm-hmm. At least we try. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I think that, but I don't think that when we were educated, those things were still present. They were more diluted. but we knew that forests had to be sustainable, for instance. But maybe in order to see how things happen, we have to do and see the results. And sometimes the results were not the ones that people were expecting, and then we adapted. But I think that the ecology principles were already present in our curricula a long time ago, and we knew that we should take care of the future generations to have exactly the same services that we had now. Maybe we were not able to do it immediately, but I think we are on the good way. I'm an optimistic. I have always been.
We have to be.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, that's the formation, education of the engineers. The other thing is, of course, also the introduction of new ideas, concepts among the managers, among the plantation managers. So, Luis, could you say a bit about that? How works this adoption of the new generation plantations? From sociological studies on adoption of new technologies among farmers or foresters, we know that the best adoption goes if you learn from your neighbor or your colleague, your peer. So is that a technique that you use to go with plantation managers to other plantations where they adopted already some new ideas and go like that from mouth to mouth in convincing people of introducing new ideas on sustainability?
Yeah, what we call the social learning techniques. Yes. So a mix of practice. So normally we organize long programs of 5 days where we combine visits to the restoration sites, to the plantation sites, to the communities. We stimulate the different stakeholders with completely different backgrounds coming from different geographies, that they get a real experience of understanding why the other has a different view about the same object, right? So we are two different people, we look into the same glass and we see different things. So why is that? So that's a very strong tool that we should increasingly use if we want to generate the space for these different ways of understanding how we should go forward solving these complex issues. Okay. That's pretty much the tools that we use, combining then with think tanks like this one in order to generate that space. When you say this looks like heaven on earth, you know, this is not a fixed model. What we have here, it's a continuous dynamic process in the landscapes with which they are continuously changing as society changes, as the communities living there change. Everything is in continuous change. So we need to understand that plantations, they are part of that process. So there is not a starting point, neither an ending. And it's about moving those models into becoming dynamic. Because what we have here, and with the Green Deal and with the climate agenda, it's indeed the momentum has come. But to realize that momentum, we need to be very clear and very proactive on our proposal. When this initiative started more than 12 years ago, basically the sector, at least the sector I contacted with, it has a defensive narrative, and communication was something reactive, always explaining why and almost apologizing. Sorry, I'm here because... And basically what we did during these 10 years of using the social learning, using think tanks, was to generate an active proposal explaining that if we truly want to move towards the Green Deal and to the bioeconomy, we need to understand that we need to combine different land uses. Some of them might not be very pleasant to our eyes. They need to be intensive, but we need to have also a combination of natural forests, intensively managed plantations, and intensive agriculture, and doing that in a way that the different elements in our society, from the local communities to the urban communities, they understand why sometimes we don't always take the decisions that our art would tell us, because we love beautiful landscape, but it's not always 100% possible. So that's very much the rationale.
You have realized such projects, I think mainly with large companies like Mondi Forest in South Africa and so on. But of course, the reality of plantation forestry in Europe is very different. We have a lot of smallholders, which have maybe lower capacity in terms of knowledge or organizational structure and so on. Also more difficult to reach. So have you also experience with working with the smallholders, or how could we organize that?
Yeah, it's a much bigger challenge from some elements, but on the other side, and when we deal with concepts such as creating shared value, then landscapes where predominantly we have small landowners, in terms of that capillarity of sharing the benefits, it's already there. So basically, the challenge is they move into how can we find solutions to organize and associate those small landowners, and then to build the value chains so that they can have ways to work with the market and to engage with the market side. So I would say that every model, they have their strengths and their weaknesses, and again, it's about finding the ways to bring the different actors which are involved on those landscapes into lively engagement processes where you can really go in depth of those challenges and then try to come with common solutions.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the third statement. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, this is the statement of Joe O'Hara. It says, only multidimensional forests and foresters will thrive and survive. A very short, clear statement. And I interpret it as a pledge for a more land sharing approach rather than a land sparing approach. It calls, I think, for more multifunctionality, integrating multiple ecosystem services in our plantation forests. So maybe that means also to go to less intensive management, longer rotations and so on. Before hearing you, I go to the other partners, and let's start with Margarita. What do you think? Should plantation forests of the future stay in their land sparing approach, so really going very intensively, short rotations, monocultures, and then like that spare land for conservation and so on? Or should they more move into the direction of multifunctional forests with multiple ecosystem services, or is there some way in between? Please.
Maybe we must tell you that we never saw these sentences. It's the first time. So my first comment that Joe knows English much better than me, but for me this sentence has different meanings depending on the definition of forest. What is a forest? If a forest will be a set of stands, then multidimensional forests can be obtained by land sharing or land sparing, because or by a mixture of them. That's what I think will be the best. If a forest is a stand, then a multidimensional forest is just multifunctional forest. No, but it cannot be. Yeah, I thought so. Okay. So I totally agree with this sentence. It's more or less in a different way, telling that we need to do optimization of ecosystem services at landscape level by having different types of forests, protecting the water courses and all other things that we are starting to do in our plantations in Portugal, not having 300 hectares clear cuts like we had 30 years ago or so. So I totally agree with that. And in order to thrive and survive, we have to change a little bit the way, and we are changing, the way we manage our forests at landscape level, because that's the only way to become sustainable. Even to forest fires, for instance, So we have to, but the problem that is missing here, the problem is if the society is very complex, if we have small landowners, if the forest is not profitable like it is in Portugal, it is not profitable, then it will be very difficult to implement this model without some support, outside support. Because the big problem to implement the management at landscape level is the land ownership and the profitability of the forest, in my opinion. Because all landowners, if they find that it will be profitable to invest on the forest, they would invest on the forest. The problem is that every time I do economic analysis, is not my specialty, economy, but every time I do economic analysis, then the result is that the forests, most of the forests in Portugal are not profitable. Even the eucalypt plantations, they are profitable if they are located in good sites. But sometimes they are not located in good sites. And then people say that, but you are not using the correct prices for the forest operations. Okay, then sit with me at a table and let's discuss the forest operation prices and redo the analysis again. So, in order to have good forest management, we need to guarantee that the forest is profitable for the landowners. I'm telling that because in Portugal, 90-something% of the forest is private. So, if it's not profitable for the landowner, then they won't do a good forest management.
Okay, thank you. Pedro, do you believe that we should intensify at the stand level to make space somewhere else in the landscape for these other ecosystem services? Or do you believe that we should take the other ecosystem services on board in our management, even at stand level?
Yeah. My idea is that it's not possible to cover all the aspects of the multifunctionality of the forest in each plot. So I think that this, at least in the area that I know better, that is fragmented forestry, that is small plots and so on, that need to be taken into account regionally. That is, regionally you need to monitor if these supposed functions of the forest are covered, and that has been done in the PEFC certification system that has been monitored and is measured at regional level, and this, in that way I think that is covered. And the problem is if you pretend and you hope that everything is covered in each of the plots. That is not possible. And in the other hand, probably there are functions that make sense, that are better covered by the public forests, because they are owned by the public entities, and that make more sense that these functions like, I don't know, landscape or recreation or, I don't know, a special protection for biodiversity probably makes more sense, that is taking more into account in the forests that are owned by the government or by the town halls. I think that for me, basic is that three pillars need to be taken into account, as was mentioned by Margarita. That is, the economic point need to be taken into account, the ecological and the social. The three need to be balanced. That is, unless we have that, it's true that it's not possible to survive for long term. And the other risk is, as mentioned by Margarita, that is the abandonment. If you put too many conditions, too many limits to the functioning or the harvesting or the activity of the forest owner and the companies that are harvesting that probably makes that the companies or the activity itself is less competitive. So that will be abandoned. That is, I think, one of the main risks that we have is this abandonment. That is, and I think that one message for the Commission, for me, is that we need to give some solution to this situation of fragmented forests. There are a lot of small forest owners that it doesn't make any sense to continue investing in these small plots. Some measure need to be put in order to group these forests and to have a minimum size for making the planting activity competitive, at least more hectares than the current situation is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's indeed a very good idea to stimulate group management. In some countries, initiatives have been taken by the government to stimulate such groups, maybe pay a coordinator for common management works, common auctions of the wood, etc., etc. And it's probably a good idea to have that also in the CAP financing, this stimulation of integration of management between smallholder plantation managers. I think that's a nice idea. Louis, integration of ecosystem services with production of wood in plantation forests. I think that certain ecosystem services are much more easy to integrate than others. So which ones, according to you, are very easy to integrate? And which ones are much more difficult to integrate and should we realize probably somewhere else?
Well, I think depending on the circumstances and where we are, it varies a lot. It's because looking here to the statement, I would think of multidimensional landscapes where forests are. And when we work with those multidimensional landscapes, thinking on the different ecosystem services and using participatory dynamics with the different communities and stakeholders, you might get to different solutions. So there is no one solution, a perfect solution at the end of the process. Because it's a negotiation process. It's not just about what science will tell us that it's the best model or mosaic for that landscape, but it's also what the combination of the different groups of interest in that landscape will be willing to accept, and which trade-offs they will be also willing to put way forward. So I think from my experience, either working with ecosystem services related with biodiversity or water or soil or carbon, they're all possible to address. It depends much on the dynamic of the different groups involved on the negotiation process. But I just want to say also one word here to the foresters, the multi-dimension foresters, which I think it's an interesting one. But again, here I think it's about us bringing multi-dimensional expertise into the process. So, and not try the foresters to solve all the issues, but the multi-dimensional, yes, bring different expertise to help us work on our problems. I think that's crucial for the future.
Yeah, I like that opinion. Maybe we foresters have too long believed that we can solve all the problems, and involving other expertise, also sociological expertise, for example, anthropological expertise is really a benefit. Yeah, thank you. Joe, multidimensional forests. My feeling is that biodiversity is maybe the most challenging thing to integrate in multidimensional forests, especially in areas like Scotland, where it's known for high biodiversity values of open areas, which are the result of a very strong human nature interaction. We think about moorlands and heathlands and very specific biodiversity linked to that. Yeah. How do you create multidimensional landscapes where we can produce the wood we need for our circular bioeconomy, but still conserving those values where people give a lot of value to?
Thanks. Well, apologies for my use of the language in an international audience, but I did select it quite carefully. I didn't say multifunctional, I did say multidimensional. And that was really to pick up, and I'm really pleased my colleagues on the panel have picked that up. I think multi-dimensions of scale is really vital here. And you picked that up first of all, Margarita, and going from what you can do at a stand level, what you can do at a catchment level, landscape level, and then what you can do at a national level. And I think this balancing of risk at those three levels is probably, from a policy perspective, that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. And whether that's risks to the forests themselves or to the ecosystem service functions that they provide, or to the communities that are either living alongside them or are paying for them through their taxes or some other means. I think all of these factors come into play here. So as far as the biodiversity question, I'm with Margarita. I don't think you can be a forester and not be an optimist. You have to believe in the future is going to be good to plant a tree in the first place. And I think we've come a huge way in terms of the biodiversity question. Biodiversity is never static. And this question of open land versus wooded land is changing, and we're learning about it all the time. And the science is changing all the time, because what is your baseline? Is your baseline an overgrazed, overburnt, potentially landscape that has a certain number of very, very rare species that are only surviving there because they've been decimated elsewhere? Is that your benchmark? Or do you go back to another point in time? Or do you project forward into a climate-changed world where you're going to need a different, potentially, assemblage of species in order to thrive? So I think that's and I'm not a biodiversity specialist, but I think I think it's a very complicated answer to question. What I would say is in Scotland, that the word, and I was pleased to hear people mention it, that got us so much support for the strategy, which has got ambitious plans to increase forest area. We did 11,200 hectares last year. I think it's one of the highest deforestation rates in Europe, with very little public pushback. And it's this word integration, particularly between different land uses. Foresters have got to come out of this, I'm in a box and it's labelled forester and this is what it means to be a forester. So I really did like the points that came out at the end about the people, and reaching across particularly to the farming communities, to other land using communities. So in our context, we have the sporting estates, we have the recreational land users, but particularly the farmers. I have a degree in agriculture and in forestry, and having this firm barrier with farmers on one side and foresters on the other, and it might even be a physical fence, is just nonsense, because agriculture can benefit from trees and the trees can benefit from agriculture, be that at a business level, at an ecosystem level, or in a productivity level. So that point, I was particularly about multidimensional foresters. We've got to work in teams. The other professions that come into play here, we have benefited massively from landscape architecture as a profession in forestry and the principles of plantation redesign. I think it's an under-recognised profession that can bring us so much. They're used to dealing with landscape. So landscape architects, farmers who are used to working with the land, ecologists, and then the social scientists. This how to engage, all the stuff, the participatory planning, absolutely is the way to go. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but...
Yeah, no, excellent. That was very good. Also, I think finding this balance in the landscape for biodiversity values of open and closed landscapes, not thinking too static like many people do. We live in a changing environment. We can recreate forests with the forest microclimate, forest species, and so on. So, that was very satisfactory, I think, your answer. Let's go to the fourth and last statement by Pedro. And it reads, goods from sustainably managed forests should be promoted due to their renewability, recyclability, and biodegradability. That way they will substitute environmentally damaging materials like plastic, iron, and concrete, hereby fighting against climate change. So here we'll leave a bit the plantation forest and we focus on the products from this plantation forest. And indeed, I think the complete picture includes the products, because thinking in terms of circular bioeconomy, where we get rid of the petrol and the fossil energy sources to drive our economy, and using wood as a resource, a basic material to realize that, is a major argument for having plantation forests, I think. So let's change a bit the order. Maybe, Luis, we can start. What is your idea on this importance of the products, and how should we put the products from the forest in the market?
Well, I think this statement brings a very important element to the discussion on plantations. Typically, I tend to use a slide which the title is "Why we need plantations?" And if not for any other reason, it's just because we have a big problem related with use of non-renewable materials. Someone mentioned here that we talk a lot about energy on the climate challenge, and we don't talk that much about everything we use, right? We are here in this meeting room, and this meeting room does have an enormous footprint from the materials that it's made of and has been sourced from mining and other non-sustainable ways of producing. If what we have here has been produced from this model that we are discussing here, from renewable sources, from what technology allows us to produce from fiber and wood, we would turn the footprint into a positive impact back to nature. And I think that's, for me, what this quote talks about is when we receive that criticism against plantations and the backlash that we don't need plantations and we need more natural forests, we need to remind people that there are trade-offs. And we need to be clear on which future we want to build. And if we can't have both things. So this is a very strong narrative that we need to put out there with more clarity, because I think this is a fundamental piece of the equation of our work and narrative.
Okay, thank you. We need to speed up a bit because we need time for also questions from the public. Margarita, which products are really the future of plantation forests? Do you think it's feasible that they will provide us with bioenergy, for example? Will there ever be enough, or is that also not a threat to our plantation forests?
We are always changing, but I don't know, maybe in the future. Nowadays with the biorefineries, every day we are finding that wood and not only wood, cork and other forest products can provide so many materials that who knows if in the future we won't use wood for bioenergy, because there's better uses for it. It's a learning process, I think. That's something that I just want to comment, something that Luis told that science cannot tell which is the best model. This is not the whole of science. The whole of science is to give answer to what-if questions. We will never tell foresters what is the right way to do, but we need to understand very well the forest ecosystems. That's why I think we should have long-term monitoring of some intensively instruments sites. It's because we need to be able to give answers to what-if questions, not solutions. This is a very important issue, that sometimes people think that the whole of science is to provide solutions, but it's not. It's to increase knowledge, and with that knowledge to be able to give answer to the what-if questions that foresters and stakeholders will make us.
Okay,
yeah.
Statement. Joe, does the general public understand sufficiently well the mitigation potential of the use of forest products? Or is there also a large way to go, just like we said in the beginning, to explain to people why we plant and cut trees, also why we need them for this circular bioeconomy and get rid of the fossil fuels?
Yeah, totally. And the focus on the climate change and ecological crises it just gives us such a superb narrative in all of this. I've got 2 teenage daughters who were taught that cutting down trees was bad. And I heard somebody even mention that thing. We've got to explain why we cut down trees. Don't start with the thing that people have an issue with, which is cutting down trees. Start with the positives, what I really like about this statement. Start with talking about fabrics that people are wearing and whether they come from petrochemicals or whether they come from wood. Your point, Margarita, about the bioeconomy. Talk about concrete and iron and the impacts they have, and actually you could use wood to do that better. Get people bought into the product and then start talk about how you get to the product. And I think it's a much healthier way to start the conversation rather than defending cutting down trees. So I think this is really, really vital, and we really need to get better at it.
Thank you. Pedro, this is your personal statement, not necessarily the statement of your company. But of course, if wood becomes such a success as a biomaterial, a source for the biorefinery and so on, does that not lead to a tremendous competition for users between companies and sectors? If we start to use wood for the biorefinery, will there still be wood for the paper industry? Is that not a worry?
Well, always for a company that is investing a large amount of money for having best technology, it's always a worry to have or not to have raw material for the future, because they are long-term investments. But on the other hand, we are used to be in the market and to compete with other materials, with other competitors, and that is the normal business. So that is not. I think that obliges us to be more innovative and to look to better solutions and to take advantage of the existence of the raw materials, the best raw materials. Also to collaborate with the stakeholders and to be part of the market. That is a worry, but is a normal worry for us. I think that one of the missing parts of our activity is that we are not good in communicating that. I think that we need to make an effort and to as well to have better experts in communication, because we are not the best experts on communicating. And for communication, I think that we need to have a strategy to make aware of people that they make better choices, and with better choices, probably the planet will be in better conditions in the future. So that is a story that we need to tell, and it's true as well that there are plenty of abandoned land that is ready for plantation. I didn't see the problem.
No, I think that last thing is a very important statement, that the forest and wood sector can still improve in their communication to the outside world compared to, like, for example, the steel or the concrete industry. Of course, those industries have the advantage that they are a few very big companies, while the wood industry is much more scattered among smaller companies. But to speak with one voice, I think, is indeed very important. And of course, there's a lot of possibilities for industrial symbiosis. If we think about biorefineries based on lignin, which can use the waste of the paper industry as a source of their activities. Okay, I think it's time to get some questions from the public. And as Ula said, there is a microphone at your left hand, and you can press on the button and answer your question. Please, go ahead. And maybe it's good to present yourself very shortly.
From the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Germany. Many thanks to EFI for this excellent Think Forest event, and also many thanks to Peter Freer-Smith and his team for the very good report. I heard in the morning a lot of about equilibrium, about the balance of the forest functions from the panelists, and I do agree with all those statements. My point is, and I would like to remind you on the citation of our new Think Forest chairman in the morning on the Green Deal. I fully agree his positive mood on his statement. However, we have a question that the new EU forest strategy should be built on the 2030 biodiversity strategy, which could be understood as a shift to more protection of forest. And of course, this question might be even more relevant depending on the Commission services who is going to write the strategy. And my question to the panelists is now, wouldn't such a shift not limit the economical interest of land owners to invest in new plantations? And the point was made, I think, by Professor Tomé and also by you, Pedro. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a very relevant question. Let's take a second one, yes?
Okay. Building on this, I think
Can you
it's
present
important.
yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Teresa Presas, and I'm in the Navigator company. This sector has been facing a long-lasting conflict with society, which is very difficult to maintain. It has been fueled by regulators, NGOs, the press, while the industry has been largely quiet on this. We just heard that the coming forest strategy, EU forest strategy, might be based on biodiversity. So again, it's another element to increase this conflict with society. So my question is actually twofold. First, whose responsibility is it? And I know the answer will be a shared responsibility, but is it shared by really getting together all the stakeholders, or individual stakeholders by sector doing it? And the second is, have we seen any changes in public perception? Perception is reality. So have we seen any changes in public perception in the last, 5 years, 10 years? We've been having this narrative for at least, that I know, 30 years. And here we are repeating it again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Two questions, and later on, if we have time, we go further. So the first question is about, let's say, the pressure to maybe set aside more forest land for no management or conservation management, which could lead to a disinterest of further investments in forestry by landowners. And the second question is all about the image of this sector towards the stakeholders, and the progress in public perception on this sector. Would you like to start? Yeah.
I'll maybe start with the second question, because I'm probably more easy with that one than the one about the Commission. So I would say, yes, there has been a change in public perception, and our experience of just having gone through a general election where suddenly trees were all over everybody's manifesto. It was as if every political party was fighting to see who could get the biggest number in for the number of trees that they were going to plant if they got into power. And this is because climate change has completely changed the narrative. And the millennial generation and the Gen Z that are coming up behind them, you just have to look at the commentary online against any of the media reports and what have you. Their perception in the UK, I can see you shaking your head, but we've been tracking it in the UK.
The other thing is cutting.
Yes, but they're part of the same thing about planting the trees, and it comes back to that final point that was about the products that come from this. Is when you talk to people about plastics, about the petrochemical industry, and people still want stuff. They're still going to want stuff in the future, but they want stuff that it is less damaging. And if you say to them, it comes from trees, and it can come from plantations like some of the third rotation plantations that we now have in the UK, which people also cherish for their recreation, for their mountain biking, for the walking, the forest bathing that they're doing, and they see that the timber is coming out of it because that message has been taken to them, we are definitely seeing a change, and we are able to harvest without huge outcries, but it's because we pay attention to the detailed design of those forests. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, is these things have to be designed well and work well. But there has been a change in the dialogue, definitely. It's a different conversation I'm having now than I did even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there someone that could give an answer to the first question on the set aside, the decrease in management intensity? Yeah, Margarita?
It's very difficult to answer because it's completely against what I told before. But it will depend a bit on how the countries will implement the CAP, I suppose. And before we see that, because for the landowners, the private landowners, if the investment won't be profitable, they will not do it for sure. So it's difficult to answer. But for the second, I think that we can see very small changes, some changes, but very small. And I think that the industry is not doing a good job, in my opinion. Because even me, I'm a forester, and I've been involved very recently in the Navigator Council of Environment or something like that. And I like to go to these meetings because I'm learning what the industry is doing to improve the impact, even of the mills, on the environment. And I was not aware of all these investments. And I think that people should know that. And no one tells them. Okay, so I think that the industry has a long way in showing how they are acting and trying to improve their relationship with the environment. And even in the forestry, you do a lot, but we could do more, because there's, in my opinion, the pulp companies in Portugal, and I have to be careful because there's a lot of people in the assistants, but I think that some years ago they started to modify the way they were acting because they needed. They needed to have the paper certified, so they started to be more worried with the environment. They started to change the way they were managing the forest. They were doing these investments in the mills that I was not aware of. But suddenly, in order to do these changes, they had to integrate in their teams people with other thoughts, with other ideas. And now I see that they are all very proud of what they were able to do. And I think this is a change in mentality that is very, very nice. I like to go there and talk with them. Even the I don't know, mechanical engineers or so, they show that they are investing every year a certain amount on improving the energy use and the water use and everything in the mills. And they are happy to show that they are doing well with the environment. And I think it has been a good move, and they should, and most people are not aware of that.
Okay. Pedro, a short answer to this?
We as a company, we are more in the contrary. We are seeing that from a study that we made with the University of Madrid, there was a study on the situation of the wood mobilization in the north part of Spain, and they reached the figure of less than 60% of the annual increment was harvested in this area. So the problem is more the contrary. The situation, real situation, is that it's not mobilized all the potential that the forest has. And if we do that, we are going in the contrary sense. So if we want to go against the climate change and we want to improve the environment, we need to go more in the contrary. That is, wood mobilization is a good tool to, for example, in our country, is reduce the biomass content, reduce the risk of forest fires, improves biodiversity. So that is not bad news to increase the mobilization of wood. It's more in the contrary. I think that this only taking into account the protection, only taking into account the biodiversity, is not taking the holistic approach of what is forest about. Forest about is the three pillars. Is sustainability, makes into account ecological, economical, and social aspects. And good balance on that is the best solution.
Okay, thank you. I indeed am very convinced that we need to continue to explain to people why we cut trees. And even biodiversity can be a very important reason to cut trees in certain circumstances. Let's take 3 more questions. There was one there, one here, Michele, and then the lady.
Hello, my name is Kevin Oño. I work for ESG.
Press the button, please. Yeah. No, it's not different. Just behind the microphone, there's a small button. Yeah, that will be better.
Sorry.
My name is Xavier Noyon. I work for PFC International, and I have one very small question. I haven't heard the word genetic GMO today. Is it something that is considered in the work you do? Is the absolute ban and prohibition of anything the only solution? Is it still discussed, or there is no way today, because of the acceptance problem, to even consider the question? And is there a reason to consider it or not? Is it something that you come across?
Okay, thank you. That's taken. Michele?
Yes, thank you very much. Michele Bozzano from the European Forest Institute. More than a question will be a reaction to Mr. Hausmann's statement before that was calling on the potential conflict between forest management, the need to have forests that produce, and biodiversity conservation. I coordinate the European Forest Genetic Resource Program, and our core business is the conservation of the genetic diversity of forestry species. And what I'm saying, it is relevant of the conservation of the three levels of diversity, the species and ecosystem as well. Now, today, as ever in history of forestry and forest management, we need to actively manage the forest. You know, in the moment that we have a tremendous change happening in the forest, having practitioners that they know how to manage the forest, that are on the ground and they can monitor the changes and then can react to the changes, is the best way we have to ensure that we can conserve this genetic diversity. We conserve the diversity that we have. There is a concept that was invented not many years ago, and we call it sustainable forest management. And this is really the best way that we can ensure that we can have a production and we can have conservation of the genetic diversity. The two things is they can be on the same side of the coin. So doing one properly ensure that we properly can conserve the genetic diversity. This is really important. We don't have to negotiate to set aside a large portion of the landscape to conserve our genetic diversity. No, we can conserve very effectively the genetic diversity, the species diversity, and the ecosystem diversity from the forest where we can do proper forest management. Sorry for taking this, but I thought that it was important to complement with a community, a perspective of a community that really has the conservation of the genetic diversity as a core business. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent comment. And then a question there.
Yes, good morning. My name is Silvia Melegari, and I represent the European sawmill industry, so the wood mechanical industry. And the first point that has to be understood is that we only rely on the material who comes from Europe, so above 90% of the material purchased by the European sawmill industry come from European forests, so there is no import of the sector. And I would like to stress that the question that the industry is always confronted, it's not about if using wood is sustainable or not. This is clear. We had an EPPC report last summer in August. We have a different paper from the Commission. Everybody even recognized the substitution effect of wood product compared to other material. But the question with whom we are confronted, it is how much wood we can actually harvest. And this is the key point. The other key point with what the industry is confronted is make a prediction about the wood availability. In this moment, the market is overloaded of timber, of logs, because of the bark beetle effect, but what is going to be the future? If we do not have a prediction about the wood availability, then the industry cannot make investment. So this is the reality with wood. The industry is always confronted, and there is a kind of lack of cooperation unfortunately, amongst the industry in some part of Europe, and not everywhere, but about the cooperation with the industry and the forest owner. So we lack of the information. Where is the wood, how we can purchase it, who is making specific investment. So this is the reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very relevant question as well. Let's start with the one on the GMOs. And maybe I ask Luis for a first reaction, because well, WWF was one of the main initiators of the FSC standard, and if I'm not mistaken, GMOs are still excluded from FSC certification. Yes. So what is the future of GMOs in European plantation forests? Do we need them? Is there scientific research making progress in that? What can they bring for the better or for the worse?
Well, there are three things there. In FSC, it's so GMOs. It's not an acceptable technology currently. Within WWF, we take a science-based approach to the discussions around the GMs, and specifically on the forestry sector, we have been following quite carefully what have been the different works and forums organized on the theme. And we think that it needs to be a combination in terms of what science is telling us about new and evolving technologies such as GMs, and also in terms of the social license to operate in the different regions where we operate. As I said, there are very different perceptions and social acceptance of these topics, including the GMs, if we work here in Europe or if we go into the southern hemisphere. And we need to take that in consideration in our work as an international organization. So I don't think there is a clear answer or yes or no, but as many of these aspects, we try to understand the debate, the discussion, what science is telling us, and what are the best approaches on case by case. In terms of the European context, I don't think I probably the best entitled person to discuss about this, but I tend to think in almost like in a personal basis that black and white decisions on these topics, I don't tend to agree with them. I think we should take an open analysis and see when it could make sense and give us tools that could address some of the challenges we face, and when indeed it would not be applicable and we should not have.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's focus then on the second question, which is about sustained yield. How can we assure that in the future the standing stock of our planted forests stays constant, that we are not overcutting when the circular bioeconomy is so much asking so much biomass from our forests. So do we have stress tests to control the intensity of harvesting in our European forests? And Margarita, I know that you're a specialist in forest management and decision support systems for forestry. So what is the gap between what scientists offer as tools to foresters and what foresters and also governments use in practice to make sure that European standing stocks stay at a certain level? Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, in most countries, we have tools that can make reasonably good predictions of the wood availability in the future, depending on different scenarios. But the biggest problem, in my opinion, are the hazards. Because, for instance, if I use the tool that we developed at my institution for Portugal, if we don't use any scenario for future fires, then we will be plenty of wood. If we add scenarios on fire, and they are just scenarios, no one knows if they will be like that or not, then the situation changes a lot. But yes, you have tools. I don't know in other countries if the tools are available, but at least in my country, all the tools that we develop, they are freely available for everyone. Sometimes the problem is that the stakeholders say the tools are not so easy to use, and so they need our help to use them. But if we do very easy tools, where you cannot change the management and several issues related with the scenarios, then they are not useful. So they have to be slightly complex, but I think in Europe we have several tools. We even have some tools that do predictions at European level, but I don't know the right word. So they are good for general scenarios, but I wouldn't trust them so much to know exactly the wood that will be available. I would trust more on tools applied at country level because they are more detailed, they use better predictions of growth, and they can incorporate many management alternatives. But we can talk about tools to predict wood availability after the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. But I think it's indeed a worry, and we need to make sure that we have the monitoring systems in place to make sure if the bioeconomy becomes really a success, that we keep an eye on the standing stocks in our forests. Well, it's almost 12 o'clock, so we have to close our debate. I want to thank our panelists. They have been really great and helped us to get insights in this complex matter. If I can say a few words, I think we learned that public opinion for sure changed on their view on planting trees and forests with climate change. We also saw that also plantation managers changed a lot in the way how they incorporate sustainability in their plantations, and there's a huge progress from that point of view. But probably there's still a challenge to explain better to people why we cut and harvest trees and why we need those trees for a circular bioeconomy. We also learned that integrating other ecosystem services on top of wood production is quite a challenge, but that we can realize that at the landscape level by having this multidimensional approach to our forest management, and so taking very specific issues into account like carbon sequestration, biodiversity, recreation, landscape aesthetics, and so on. I hope you enjoyed this debate. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I hope you all agree that this was really good. By the way, Bart, I will not repeat some of the conclusions which you have done already in my name, because they were really to the point. But I would just go quickly through recapitulation of what we have heard today. And to the end, I will do some summary of my takeoffs from what we should remember and have into mind when we talk about those issues in the future. We have heard from Minister Doyle about the importance of science and policy, collaboration, then the growing relevance of the forest sector in the European Union from the Commission, CAP as the main tool. How can plantation forests contribute to Greendale? And I think very good policy recommendations which came from the presentation of Professor Freer-Smith. I think all was very nicely presented and also clear. The debate which was organized, the panel was really excellent, and I think also the chairing was super excellent. And if I just try to give you the summary of what captured my attention from the first statement from Margareta, an increase of area of highly productive plantations, it's needed. The reactions that we should engage more emotions. Good design connects science, product, and people. I think it's very important to remember that. From the sector of industry, sustainability is a must. In Europe, it's more difficult to communicate the role of plantations with the society than on the southern hemisphere. How forest should be put at the heart of the bioeconomy is a serious question. On the second quote, on new generation plantations integrate well all positive angles from Luis. We have heard the comments that demonstration of what is possible, it's clear, but that is not exactly what is happening. We have to be honest about mistakes in the past. We have heard that it's great that NGOs want to be part of the solution, also from the industrial interest angle. We have heard that long-term learning process for forest managers, it's fact, and requirements change through the time. In the third debate on only multidimensional forests and foresters will thrive and survive, we have heard the comment that depends on the dimension of the forest, on the definition of the forest. Either we talk about land sharing or land sparing balance or else. And one very important message about the profitability of the sector, in particular when it comes to small managers and the need for the outside support. We have also heard that it's not possible to cover all multi-dimensional aspects in all cases, and that's likely easier in the public-owned forests. Different solutions work for different circumstances. We need also multi-dimensional expertise. And as it was mentioned by Chairman, biodiversity, it's probably the major challenge in the approach. But we have heard the comments that the changes are coming and the approach is not static, and in particular the call of more collaboration and discussion among farmers and foresters. And finally, in the last session, goods from sustainably managed forests should be promoted. We have heard that it's essential, that's essential for moving into bioeconomy, and a major argument for plantation forest, but there are, of course, also trade-offs we should talk about. That science should answer what if questions and not prescribe solutions. That we should talk about more about concrete and iron instead of cutting the trees beginning, because we always have to clearly understand what are the alternatives, and we have also heard that forest sector can still improve communication comparing to some other industries which have tried that in the past. So I also agree that when you look into the famous Ellen MacArthur circular economy, on one hand you have non-renewable, on the other hand you have renewable story, that the essential question is how you move some of the from one wing to another wing, from a non-renewable to renewable wing. But the major mistake which you could do that, it's exactly if you don't take care for the ecosystems and preservation and sustainability, because if you don't care for that, that's actually a kind of direct line for destruction, not indirect even. If I summarize, I have 6 points of the takeovers from today's debate, which are the things which either resonate with me most and which I think we should take into account in future developments. When it comes to the forests and when it comes to plantation forests, it's pretty clear that no size fits all. And that the differences in European countries in the circumstances are quite huge. And when we will be designing new instruments like EU forest strategy, like from farm to fork, like pan-European guidelines for afforestation and reforestation, there will be very likely again the question on the table how much that could be done on European level and how much it's actually national sovereignty. Because I remember that that was the major question which we were always dealing with when it comes to those issues. There would be only one remark which I would do in that respect. If you are living in a world as we are living today, which is much more interconnected and interdependent than ever, then our joint and individual responsibility for the solutions in the future has enormously increased, which means that you also have to share more sovereignty. You like it or not, because sharing sovereignty actually means cooperating more, nothing else. So I think this is just a thought which I wanted to share when it comes to forests also. Second, which resonates with me very well, it's that the size really matters. And like we have the different and specific questions when it comes to small farmers, we have specific questions also when it comes to small holders of the plantations and forests. So one of the advice which I have heard very clearly coming from the panel was that the Commission should absolutely more take into account those kind of differences if we want to efficiently address the questions which are related to that. Third, in the context of Green Deal, we have heard the comment that momentum has come, and I do agree. I think that's exactly what we have to be very much aware. I will call again that it's very important for the Commission in all the next steps of the proposals, which will be done in the future in connection of implementation of Green Deal, that it should focus on creating and strengthening the ownership of all stakeholders. Because only if you do that, then you will have people who believe in what you do, explain it well, and that ownership actually makes the things possible. Otherwise, they are simply not possible. And I firmly believe that the success of this Green Deal story actually very much depends on how well we will integrate the social story. If the social story will not be integrated, it will be no go. So it's essential that we keep that we keep the balance very well designed. We have seen in some countries of Europe what does it mean if you do the steps in the right direction in the wrong way. So you need to design those steps very well, and social related policies have to be an important part of the solutions when it comes to Green Deal. The fourth remark is actually a bit of worry which I have in the context of what we are discussing. We know that we have on the table already practically the proposal for multi-annual financial framework for, by the way, 2027. If it's for 27, it means there will be no other financial framework for delivery of climate change 2030 commitment and no other framework for SDGs commitment. There will be no other. It's this. Was it the ambition of the previous Commission which actually designed the multi-annual financial framework, including the common agriculture policy, aligned with the ambition of Green Deal or not? Because if it was not, then we have a problem. So that's just a bit of the thinking that we are aware that this is the only tool which we currently have in our hands, and we have to do it right. Fifth, I would just like to comment a bit on the biodiversity worry which resonates. You know, now I'm hearing quite frequently the comment that, of course, the interests of the business sector and the interests of the jobs, which I absolutely agree, that it needs to be very well designed and taken into account when we talk about the necessary environmental measures. My dear friends, I was fighting 10 years that this would be the case, but it was never the case, but from the other side. So we have to understand what is driving the change today. 2,000 companies around Beijing were not closed because they were non-profitable, or they were running out of steel or concrete or wood or whatever. They were closed because of the pollution of the air. Also, an agreement which we have reached in Paris, it's not because we are running short in a very short period of time of fossil fuels. No, it's because the use of fossil fuels has created consequences which are unbearable and which we have to stop. So yes, the driver of change today are environmental consequences, which of course you absolutely have to combine with, as I mentioned before, with the social and economic story, because that's essential, or it will simply not fly. But that's the driver. And the biodiversity loss, I can mention you some figures if you want, but the biodiversity loss in the past, it's a terrible consequence of the economic model which we have created. So we have to remedy those things if we like it or not. And that's part of the task which is ahead of us. So we have to integrate those things. I agree with everybody that it's not now this, but integration and equal treatment of different kind of goals which we have ahead of us, it's absolutely essential. And I will also tell you something which not many will like. We will have to dematerialize our society. Because the way we have created our economic system, it's more profit, more goods are more profit. More profit, it's more use of natural resources. More use of natural resources, it's more environmental and health impacts. So we need to revert the economic model or it will not work. So we have currently, if I just mention, the use of a privately owned car in Europe. It depends how you look at it. If you look at it through how much it's actually used, or if you look also to how much people are in the car, 2%. How many houses are empty because we are burdened with the ownership concept? In Slovenia, every third house is empty because you build house for 3 generations and then suddenly people go, the kids go a different way because we were in the after-war generation, we were in a way burdened with the thinking that owing is a success, which it's understandable, I think, because our parents were living in that kind of conditions and we were educated in that way. Young generation, it's not anymore like that. They need mobility, they don't need car. They need place to stay, they don't need to own the house. And if it comes, for example, to the food, we throw away 1/3 of the food we produce. So it's absolutely clear that we have the problem with the quantities which we have created and which are basically running the whole system, and this will create an enormous change. So for me, it's essential that we go to the philosophy, we don't need light bulbs, we need light, we don't need chair, we need to sit, we don't need a car, we need to move, we need to be mobile. By the way, we have learned very, very well that we don't need CDs. I was the part of the generation, I have 200 or 300 CDs at home, which I don't know where to, but this dematerialization has actually very good for a consumer. I'm not talking at all about taking something from somebody, but rather doing it in a different way. And also, the producers will simply have to accommodate to that. And I'm, again, not talking about, for example, you can sell, not pesticides, you can sell the protection of the 1 hectare of land against the pests. And it's also possible, but you create profit in a bit different way. But that will be necessary if we will want to align with basic things which have driven our economies mad, and with the consequences which we have. So, from ownership to functionality, from efficiency to sufficiency, dematerialization, these will be the words which we will likely or not hear more in the future, because they are essential for change. Then, the last thing which I would actually like to mention is the word about optimism. Absolutely, we have to stay optimistic. And the reason it's very simple. Optimists live much better and longer. Thank you. So that was the end of our event. And you are all nice now, of course, invited for some food for not only for thought, but also for the stomach, and also to have some bilateral discussions out there. Thank you for coming.